Okay, let's get started. So I have one announcement about the sections, which you guys may regard, most of you will probably regard as good news, which is that because of a number of complications, we're going to abort the section requirement for the class. So you don't have to come to section. It's not going to be a part of it. Does anyone object to that? Does that create problems for anyone not having a section? Does that make anyone less interested in taking this class if there's not a section? You can be honest with me. So there's lots of logistic problems. Because we're right on the cusp of the number of sections, if I picked specific section times, I was pretty sure that meant some of you wouldn't be able to take the class, which I didn't want. I want as many of you as can. In addition, we have a particular problem with the timing of the availability of one of the TFs, which is another headache. So we decided, since it's not technically required to have a section in a class that has 2.5 instructional hours per week, which is what this one does, we're just aborting the section requirement. In its stead, we're going to put into place extended office hours, both by the TF and by me, so you guys can come and chat if you want or have other issues or questions. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. And then I'll decide what to do with the 10% of the grade that was section participation. Either I'll make that, which I would love, lecture participation, raise your hands, ask, talk, push back, or I will redistribute it amongst the other components of the class. Any thoughts, concerns, questions about this? Okay. So there'll be no section requirement in the class for the person that just came in with a pink blanket. No section in the class. We're aborting that requirement. Any questions so far?
I'm a fan of lecture participation.
Yeah?
For the 10%.
Yeah? You're all for that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I mean, I have a kind of, I'm not that old, guys. I mean, I went to Yale, I graduated in 1984. I was in Styles. I'm probably the age of your parents, but I'm not like a grandpa, at least not yet. And so, I'm of the school where I like you guys to raise your hands and ask questions. And I'm really upset with the way the norms have been changing in elite education in general, and in your generation also in general, where you somehow don't want to do that. For a host of reasons, but which we can also discuss. I may push you on, but I like talking to you, and you're welcome to ask questions. And if you're confused about something, probably others are. Or if you don't agree with what I've said, you should say. And if I don't want to talk to you at that moment, say, let's talk about that later. Or I'll say, actually, no, I don't agree with you, and here's why. Right? I mean, you're smart. You're Yaleys, for God's sakes. You should be able to talk to your professors, including me, especially me. Okay? All right. So, any other questions? I always start by saying, are there any questions on the material? So that'll be a standard thing I ask, and you can ask about the last lecture before we go on. Anything left over from that? Someone afterwards gave me feedback. They said, God, that was very morose. Who thought that it was morose to start with suicide and murder? Who recognizes that suicide and murder are a part of the natural world? Yeah, I mean, they're threats to our health. They're in top 10 leading killers. And who understood that the classic use of suicide for the intellectual ideas that were at the core of the last lecture, right? It's like a magnificent example, a very famous example by Durkheim. So that's why I start with that, just to really fix ideas. And we'll come back to those ideas in less manifest ways with many other examples over the course. Okay, just a few other logistic things. We'll make slides for all the lectures available with some reasonable delay, not because we're trying to delay, but because it takes us some time to create the PDFs and get them uploaded. And so certainly by the week after I give the lectures, all the slides from the past week's lecture will be made available. We're recording it thanks to this incredible technology. The videos of the lectures will be released probably 10 days later. Again, there's some mechanics there. And we also have, not that you would want this, but I archive my lectures going back years, so if we can also make access to those, I suppose, if we need to. Please take a look at all exam dates that you can have foreseeable conflicts. So, for example, if you know your sibling is getting married, or you have some special religious event or something, tell me now. Okay, don't tell me the day before the exam that I should have told you that my cousin is getting married in Texas and I'm out of town. Okay, if unforeseen is a totally different situation. But anything foreseeable, you should write to me now and say, look, I can't come to this exam for this good reason. Everyone understand that? Okay. And part of the reason for that is we have to make special provisions for anyone that misses an exam, and it's doubly hard at the last minute than it is if we can plan for it. Okay, and I also want to open up by stressing that this class is broadly synthetic of the social sciences and medicine, and it has both quantitative and qualitative materials, and occasionally will involve allusions to biological and medical concepts, and occasionally will involve some very simple math, and much of this simple math is at the beginning of the class. Not that you should be intimidated by simple math, but especially don't get intimidated because it's only mostly at the beginning. And I have no doubt you can handle this. But a knowledge of biology or math is really not essential to this class, and I will gladly answer any questions at any time about any topic in class or outside of class. My lab is on 17 Hill House. You don't need an appointment to come to my lab. If I can't see you, I'll say I can't see you right now, or you can email my assistant and book a time to see me, and I'll happily meet with you and talk to you. Okay, last week we covered the following. Using suicide as an initial example, we contrasted personal and collective ways of studying illness, medicine, and death. And we talked about different ways more generally of understanding social phenomena. Remember, we talked about methodological individualism and methodological holism. And we described the ways that the practice of medicine differs from that of the practice of public health. We saw that human lifespans have increased dramatically in the last century, at least in the United States, from an average life expectancy in women going from 48 to 80 years in the last 100 years. And this was an amazing achievement unmatched in human history, a historic rise in human well-being. Now, of course, we recently took a step back with COVID-19, which I alluded to, and we'll come back to that, of course, throughout the course. And we were also introduced to the social patterning of longevity and causes of death. How long you live and what you die from appears to vary not only across time, but also across socioeconomic attributes. And we introduced some phenomena that we'll be considering in this class, such as neighborhoods and institutions and networks and so on. Now, in the course, we're going to be engaging in the implications of structural opportunities for individuals. And this is a long-standing debate in the social sciences and in public policy. Does your fate depend on your own choices and actions, or does your fate depend on the choices and actions of others around you, or of governments and these other big actors that might affect your life? Of course, as with everything, is it nature, is it nurture? The answer is what? Both. Right. But it's interesting to think about it that way and to see to what extent is each responsible and where is one more responsible than the other, and how might we ever tell the difference with in particular situations. And this is the tension, of course, and the difference between structure and agency. And to the extent to which each of these is important in any particular outcome is often really hotly contested, philosophically, theoretically, empirically, and pragmatically, right? A lot of the political debates we have in our society relate to this exact tension, right? Like, what's the cause of poverty? Is it that poor people don't know what to do, or is it that the government is doing bad things, right? This is an endless debate, and it becomes a political problem. It has pragmatic implications, and so on. So in the case of health, these questions become quite central. What determines health? Is it individuals or is it the environment? And who's responsible for fixing the problem? And these questions in turn raise obvious moral implications too. And behind these questions is the question of whether medical care really can make any difference at all, right? Like, if, depending on what you think the source of ill health is in our society, it will affect your vision of whether medicine is the treatment for the problems that we are facing. Consider this, for example. The United States spends more on healthcare than any other country, but we do not have the best outcomes by any means. For example, as of 2016, we spent an average of $9,400 per capita, and England, the United Kingdom, spent about a third of that, $3,377 per capita. And the people in England live longer and have fewer medical problems than we do, even after accounting for age and race and sex distribution and so on in our respective societies. And just to give you a feel for the sort of outlier the United States is, take a look at this graph, and you can see that one of these countries is not like the others, right? We spend more money per capita on health than anyone else on the planet, and there are all of these countries that are better than us in terms of the health life expectancy in years, right? I don't even know This is Korea. That's probably Greece again, my favorite example. Finland, Belgium, Denmark, Deutschland, Canada. I don't know what these, some of you may know what these abbreviate, Japan. All of these countries have better health than we do, even though we spend far more money than they do. And so the United States and the United Kingdom have roughly the same life expectancy here, but at very different levels of spending. And Japan has similar life expectancy, similar spending as the United Kingdom, but it also has even better outcomes, right? So at the same level of spending, I guess that's Japan here, and I think that's England, GBR, Great Britain there. The Japanese outperform the Brits. Now, understanding and explaining some of these differences will be one of the objectives of this course. And one of the arguments we'll be making is that while biomedical care might be effective in acute and inpatient settings, acute I mean sudden, like abrupt, in acute and inpatient settings, in chronic disease and outpatient settings, medical care may be much less effective. And if in fact people are dying mostly from chronic and not acute conditions, all of this spending that we are making, let's say on acute conditions, isn't actually yielding longer life, right? What we really should be doing is addressing the real killers, let's say, which is chronic conditions. This is an oversimplification, but that's the gist of the argument. In other words, a focus on access to health care, it can ignore the most important determinants of health, the patient's sociocultural context. And this can lead to misguided policies. And in fact, to improve the health of the public, physicians must serve as advocates for improved social conditions, public health initiatives, general and health education, and behavioral interventions, right? It leads to a kind of shift in what you think doctors should be doing in our society. Now, one argument to explain the American healthcare paradox, i.e. we spend so much, why don't we have good outcomes, is this. As shown, we spend by far the most when one looks just at healthcare. And these are some results from a former professor at Yale, Elizabeth Bradley. So here are, country by country, per capita spending. Here is American spending. I forgot in what year this is. And here's Japanese spending, for example. And somewhere here will be English spending and so on. So we spend by far the most on healthcare, just to repeat the point. But a possible resolution of the paradox is that other countries spend more on social supports in addition to healthcare. So for example, in OECD countries as a whole, for every $1 spent on healthcare, about $2 is spent on social spending. So I don't know, they don't have it as a whole. So the healthcare is in blue and total social expenditures is in red. So if you look at France, if you look at what they spend on health plus on social service expenditures, they spend more than anyone else. Here's the United States, which has this big blue outlier, but we don't spend as much on social spending. So now you can see that the totality of spending is much lower than those other countries. Maybe that's a clue. Is everyone with me? Maybe that's a clue as to what's going on, as to why those countries have better health outcomes, even though they seem to spend less per capita on healthcare. And in fact, total spending on health and social support is, so in the United States, for every $1 spent on healthcare, we spend about 55 cents on social supports. Whereas in other countries, on average, for every $1 they spend on healthcare, they spend $2 on social supports. Yes, what's her name? Was it Lucy?
Lucy.
Yeah, I'm learning names.
My question is, what does it mean when we say spending like $1 on healthcare? Because, I guess my question is, different treatments seem to me to cost different things. And are we considering, are we talking about the copay that I pay when I get my blood drawn, or are we talking about what the insurance pays? Or
your employer pays to your insurer. So I don't know in these particular data how that's computed. Sometimes these particular figure, the source is there, I don't remember. Sometimes it just looks at simple government spending. Sometimes it looks at the fraction of GDP. So that would include your spending plus the government spending plus everyone else's spending. Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that. But either way, the point would hold. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, what's your name?
I'm Elijah.
Elijah.
Yeah, what kind of social services are we talking about?
So transfers to the poor, giving money, aid to families with dependent children, Social Security money, other sort of public spending to, improve the well-being of the society. This doesn't include infrastructure spending, like roads and stuff like that. Schooling might be in here. I don't know the details of what is actually included in this particular figure, but depending on your philosophy, you might include spending on pre-K schooling or not, and so on. Did I answer your question, Elijah? Yeah. Other questions? Okay, so it's not healthcare spending that can really buy us health. Perhaps. Now, as we introduced the last time, life expectancy has changed a lot in the past century. Remember, we talked about the growth in life expectancy at birth from 48 years to 80 years in women, and so on in men, and then life expectancy at age 65 from 12 to 20 years, or whatever the specific numbers were. And note that the advances, however, have principally arisen because of improvements in mortality at early ages, and that the maximum human life expectancy has not changed. People live to be about 100. Some rare people live to be 100, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 100 years ago. More live to be 100 now than those periods, but no one ever lived to be like 200 in the past and now less, or vice versa. No one lived to be 100 in the past and now lives to be 200. The maximum human life expectancy has remained roughly constant since time immemorial. And as I said, women seemed particularly privileged in this regard, that the intrinsic biological constraint on longevity may be slightly lesser in women than men. They live longer than men. And U.S. life expectancy has increased for most of the past 60 years, but the rate of increase has slowed over time, and life expectancy has actually begun to decrease in our society even before COVID in 2014. For example, due to the opioid epidemic, right? Tens of thousands of our fellow citizens are dying, whether you're aware of it or not, from opioids right now. We have an epidemic, and those are mostly young people, so that killer in our society is reducing life expectancy at birth in our society. And a major contributor to this decline has been drug overdoses, suicides, and diseases related to the obesity epidemic as well, because we're becoming fatter and fatter as a country, and all of that weight gain contributes to cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other problems. So our life expectancy in the United States has actually been starting to go down for the last, 10 years or so. And then we had COVID as well, which made things even worse. And this is seen in young and middle-aged adults of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, with an onset as early as the 1990s, and with the largest relative increases occurring in the Ohio Valley and in New England. So these are, I don't know if you heard of so-called deaths of despair. This became very trendy to read about in the news and a lot when you guys were in middle school or in high school, which is that there were a lot of sort of poor people that were dying of so-called deaths of despair, a topic we'll return to. Nevertheless, the general increase in life expectancy or the decrease in mortality, which is clear across broad sweeps of history, is a part of a larger phenomenon known as the health transition. And this was first described in 1971 by Abdel Amran, and it's in your readings, one of your readings. So let me explain to you how to understand this, because we need long and not just so-called big data to really see what is happening here. And the conventional perspective on this phenomenon, known as the health transition, gives it 4 stages that relate to socioeconomic development and disease patterns. And this figure shows 3 lines. The CBR is which is shown in blue, is the crude birth rate, which is here. On the y-axis is the crude. So this is arbitrary time. Could be 100 years, could be 200 years, could be 50 years. And the blue is the crude birth rate. The red is the crude death rate. And the black is the total population. Okay? And there are 4 stages to the health transition. And socioeconomic development can proceed, can become more and more advanced. And then up here is a summary of the life expectancy at birth in these stages, and then some of the leading killers in each of these various stages. So I'd like to walk you through what this idea is, these 4 stages. And I'm going to describe them in terms of a typical fully developed country today, such as the United States or Canada or the countries of Europe, or similar countries elsewhere, such as Japan or Australia. And the time scale here could be 50 to 200 or 300 years. So stage 1 is the pre-modern stage, and it's characterized by a balance between birth rates and death rates. And so you have high birth rates, so every woman is having many children, okay? She could be having 5 or 10 children per woman born, but also high death rates. Many people are dying, right, in the pre-modern time. And the population is low, right? So you guys all should know that the human population on the planet was roughly the same for millions of years until about 10,000 years ago, when it started going up a little bit, but still was low till about, a few hundred years ago, and then the population started really growing, okay? So for a very long time, population growth was really tiny on the whole planet. Lots of births per woman, the crude birth rate was high, and lots of deaths per person, okay? So the death rate was very high. And this approximate balance between the births and deaths, which were about 30 to 50 per thousand people. So if you look at here, it's the number of people born per thousand and the number of people dying per thousand. It was about 30 to 50 per thousand people were born every year and died every year. A rough balance, but a few more births than deaths, so there may be a slight increase in population over time. And in fact, and so there was slow population growth, and over much of our prehistory, at least until the agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 years ago, population growth was extremely slow. And the growth rates would have been less than 0.05%, which would lead to doubling times on the order of 1 to 5,000 years. Okay, so for the human population to double on the planet would take thousands of years for that to happen. And this is known as the high stationary phase of population growth. High birth rates and high death rates and stationary population numbers. Okay, the high stationary phase. And death rates were very high at all times in this stage for a number of reasons, including a lack of knowledge about disease prevention, food shortages, and the impact of extrinsic causes of death, such as accidents and infections and so on. So people were dying from injuries, from infections, and from nutritional causes. This is what killed our ancestors, okay? And then in stage 2, average life expectancy at birth was low. Then at stage 2, something begins to happen in countries that are going through the health transition. It has happened or is happening in every country on the planet. And the first thing that starts happening is that the crude death rate starts to fall. But the birth rate remains relatively high. And as a result, the population starts to grow. Okay? So first deaths start decreasing and births stay the same. And so population rises during this urbanizing, industrializing phase of stage 2. Socioeconomic development has advanced a little bit. Life expectancy at birth now begins to go up. And this rise in population is caused by a decline in the death rate while the birth rate remains high. And then a decline in the death rate in Europe began in the late 18th century in northwestern Europe and spread over the next 100 years to the south and east. And so this is obviously a very recent phenomenon in human history. And the decline in this death rate was initially due to 2 factors. First, historically speaking, and uniquely, like for once, it only occurs once per country per history, there was a significant improvements in the food supply as agricultural practices were improved in the 18th century. Things like selective breeding, seed technology, crop rotation, and so on. And other food-related factors included the introduction of potato and corn from the Americas. So new crops from the New World were brought to the Old World and provided higher calorie benefits for the people initially in Europe. And incidentally, at this time, in England at least, this greater wealth also enabled people to marry earlier. So because the country was richer, you can imagine people tend to, even nowadays, you guys often delay marriage until you think you have the right income. By the way, I think that's a dumb decision, but we'll talk about it another time. But it's a natural human tendency seen throughout the world to think, okay, I need to be economically able to support children before I have them. What happened is, as England got richer, people started getting married earlier, which gave women the opportunity to have more babies per lifespan, which actually led to a little blip in the crude birth rate for women in England initially with rising wealth. The second thing that happened during this time period were significant improvements in public health that reduced mortality, particularly in childhood. And these were not medical breakthroughs, but improvements in things like unsexy things like water supply and sewage and food handling and general personal hygiene, arising from growing scientific knowledge of the causes of disease. And one of these things included rises in female literacy. We began to educate women, right, who were actually typically, and still are, more concerned with the well-being of children than men are, on average, in most societies on the planet. So as women gained literacy, they took a more active interest in what was happening. And a consequence of the decline in mortality in stage 2 was, as I said, this population explosion. And this growth is not due to an increased fertility, except with this little proviso I mentioned a moment ago about England, but due to a decline in deaths. And one additional characteristic of stage 2 of this health transition is a change in the age structure of the population. In stage 1, the majority of death is concentrated in the first 5 to 10 years of life, and so therefore, more than anything else, the decline in death rates in stage 2 entails the increasing survival of children, and so the age structure of the population becomes increasingly youthful. You see more kids around than you used to see when they were dying. So then what happens? Well, what happens then in stage 3, in a mature industrial country, is that people gradually become aware of the fact that their children are surviving into adulthood, right? They used to have 10 kids in order to have 2 survivors. That's an approximate number I made up, but it was pretty bad. The average woman and father lost a lot of their offspring. Just imagine how sad and tragic that would be, even if you expected that to happen. But now they said, hey, my kids are surviving, so they started having fewer kids. So then what happened is that with some lag, the crude birth rate began to fall. It still exceeds, the crude birth rate here is like 15 per thousand, and the crude death rate is, 8 per thousand. So the birth rate still exceeds the death rate, but it's now falling, and population continues to rise. So we have more socioeconomic development, life expectancy of births bumps up still more, and now we begin to see people live long enough to begin to have chronic diseases like cancer and lung disease and so on. Before they were dying young of infections and accidents and starvation. Now we've conquered those things. Their bodies, they survive longer, and now their bodies have a chance to wear out and be afflicted by chronic illnesses. So now the things that begin to afflict people and kill them shift, and the causes of death become more chronic illnesses, and the population is rising here as part of stage 3. And increased urbanization is taking place, and this changes the traditional values that were placed upon fertility and the value of children in a rural society. People had kids to help them farm the land, to provide for them in their old age, and so on. You also have the rise of the state. Some of you, have you guys taken classes in the growth of capitalism and state formation and so on? So now you start, in traditional societies, who takes care of you when you have a problem? Your family, right? In our society, who takes care of you when you have a problem? The government, right? We have health insurance, and we have public provision, and we have a state, right? Actually, we could go on a whole tangent on that, which I'm very tempted to go on, but I'm going to resist the temptation. 90% of your job in this class is to prevent me from going on tangents. And then finally, you get to stage 4, the post-industrial phase, where now you have, it's called the high stationary phase, because you have balance between birth rates and death rates, right? So every year in our society, about 1% of the people die and 1% of the people are born. Roughly about 3 million people die and 3 million people are born every year, but they're roughly in balance, leaving out immigration. And the population is, pretty stable, the population size, okay? Again, we have an immigrant society, a little different, but roughly speaking. This is called the high stationary phase. You have even longer life expectancy at birth. You've maxed out on socioeconomic development, and now you begin to see the rise of more mental illnesses kind of begin to hit the map of things that are afflicting people. And if you want to, you can look at how different and in some sense unnatural, quote unquote. Look at now the contrast between this picture, what we have, what we're in. So if you just cover up all this stuff, compare this to this. Totally different thing has happened in the West in the last couple of 100 years, and in some countries in the world, as I'll show you in a moment, literally over 30 or 40 years. This whole process has taken place. Yes, what was your name?
Sophia.
Sophia.
I know you mentioned that people started to have more mental illnesses in stage 4.
Uh-huh.
But in the earlier years, wasn't there more inbreeding and I don't know how to word this, a mix of traits in the same area? People would intermarry in the same areas, and now there's more genetic diversity.
That is a really complicated topic. We'll talk a little bit about it. So first of all, this is a cartoon summary, and all the details are not, I'm not taking into account every single aspect of it. Cousin marriage is still practiced in many parts of the world, but not in Europe, and hasn't been since the Catholic Church tried to do away with cousin marriage like 1,000 years ago. So inbreeding has not been a material problem in so-called Western world for a long time. It was at some point. There's a fascinating history of cousin marriage, and I discuss it in my book Blueprint, which is not assigned in this course. If you're interested, all the references are there. I think the main source of mental illness is and by the way, there's a whole debate about, for example, if you go to small-scale societies that live in a traditional way, like the Hadza in Tanzania, or in certain isolated tribes in Amazonia, do they have schizophrenia? What is the prevalence of schizophrenia? And their prevalence is not too dissimilar from our prevalence. It's lower, but not too much lower, okay? Because there's something really biological and fundamental about schizophrenia. But if you look at things like depression and anxiety disorders and all that stuff, we've got much more of that, okay? And part of that is felt to be a function of urbanization and modern life. These are, again, cartoon pictures. A lot of subtle differences and details in these stories. Sophia, yes, what was your name?
Nikki.
Nikki.
Do we know when stage 5 is going to occur and when there's going to be a fall in population?
Stage 5 is a great question, and we will have lectures about it and discuss it towards the end of the course, a kind of transhumanist or posthumanist. In fact, I don't know if I'm going to discuss it today, but we will be discussing it. When, I don't know when we can expect to see stage 5. Because there will be, I put it here, what might be stage 5? Yes, I forgot your name? Liz. Sophia, Nikki, Liz, Lucy, here in the middle row so far. Okay.
I may have misheard, but I believe you call the first stage high stationary?
Yes.
Second stage, or the fourth stage?
I'm sorry, first stage it should be low stationary, and this is high stationary.
Okay.
Did I screw that up? What did I say? We can roll tape and see if I screwed it up. I just want to make sure I described it correctly. I'll make sure also my notes are correct.
Yeah, I just remember it.
I'm sorry. The first is this is high stationary because it refers to the death rates. So this is the high stationary phase, and this is the low stationary phase. So both of these, crude birth rate, crude death rate, are high, and both of them are low here. Okay. Yes. What's your name?
Oh, Kara.
Kara.
Yes. I was wondering, as this kind of model was produced, was it taking into account, what was the composition of countries that it was taking into account, and whether it may be more to certain more developed countries, or?
Well, this is only in developed countries. So, if you go to certain countries, they're still back here, quote unquote, and going through it. In a minute, I'm going to show you a slide of 4 other random countries, and the time axis is different. So by now, almost all countries are going through this all countries in the world are going through the process, but they're not all at stage 4 yet in the health transition.
Globally, all countries
are engaged in this process. Globally, all countries are, but they're not all here yet, right? Some are still on this axis, and the time axis is different. So, a country going through the transition in the 21st century does it in less time than a country that went through the health transition in the 19th century.
So I guess with each, also the length of each stage?
Yes, completely. And in fact, let me just maybe go right to the next slide. And on the 5th stage, before I go there, I say I seriously doubt there'll be a 5th stage, some kind of age of immortality, although as we'll see at the end of the course, some believe in a kind of human machine or a genetically modified human kind of stage, which might constitute a kind of 5th stage. And you'll be reading about human machine, cyborg kind of advances and genetic engineering advances later in the class. You'll have some reading. And the 4th stage really does involve a delay in disease and certain other features, including, as I said, this increase in mental illness. And the 4th stage involves something known as medicalization, as we'll see in a moment. So here is the demographic transition that I said has been ongoing in every country. The transition appears to have diffused outward from Great Britain, and the speed of the transition has in general increased over time. So note that the x-axis time span varies here, And the CDR, the crude death rate slope, is getting more steeply negative in later and later countries. So if now we have the dates here. So here's Great Britain, which goes from 1600 to 2000, 400 years. And here is the crude birth rate in blue and the crude death rate in red. The crude death rate, just like I showed you, begins to decline, and then with a lag. So here's the beginning of the decline in 1794, and the decline is over by, 150 years later. Is that right? 150 years later, the lag and then the birth rate begins to decline about 100 years after the death rate declines, and then very quickly catches up, and then you get the low stationary here. Okay, we just saw that. Denmark begins its transition a couple hundred years after England. So notice it goes from 1800 to 2000 here, and everything is more compressed. The pattern is the same. The red starts declining before the blue, but there's a different slope to the two declines. Here is Spain, even later than Denmark, and here's Chile, for example, here. And from this figure here, you can see multiple countries around the world. I didn't give you all the examples, but generally speaking, the total time for the transition is declining. The steepness of the lines is changing, and countries that go through the health transition today go through faster than they did before. What's your name? Christine.
In countries like Japan and China right now, where the death rate is very eclipsing the birth rate, are we seeing like an exception to the health transition trends where we're kind of jumping in before the post-industrial stage and having this transition?
I'm not sure I understood your question fully, but generally speaking, China and Japan have gone through the same exact process. So the principal demographic problem in China right now is the lower number of children. The birth rate is still going down. I didn't really answer your question. What was your question exactly?
I just felt like the time period is a little bit more condensed.
Yes, it is more condensed. That's correct. Yeah, I mean, China, since the Cultural Revolution in the last 60 years has made it, but see, China is a special case because they had an affirmative constraint on birth, right? So they had the whole one-child policy, which was just a vast experiment. Japan is a little more in keeping with this typical situation, and Japan's had a very compressed health transition. Yes?
So you mentioned that the reason for the third stage is that because the parents are realizing, okay, more of their children are surviving.
Yes.
So active.
That's one of the reasons, yes.
Okay, so why are we observing a sudden change between stage 3 and stage 2? Because there is like this dramatic cut-off between the two stages.
Say that again? What's the issue?
And if that's the reason, then I would expect it to be happening simultaneously in the stage.
It takes time for people to believe that their children are going to survive, like a few generations. So the death rate begins to fall here, but I don't observe that immediately. So this stays high. The birth rate stays high for a while until people come to see, oh my God, everyone is living. Fewer people are dying. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So but this time period, this delay, the difference between when this declines and this declines, that is getting shorter in more recent countries. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Someone else had raised their hand? Nikki.
Yeah. Is there a correlation between sort of income per capita or like GDP and when these countries go through their different stages?
That's a very interesting question. The answer is known. I don't know it offhand, but the problem will become, how do you compare income per capita today versus 1800? You would need to do some kind of purchasing power parity, PPP, and I'm not sure. I'm sure those things have been done. I just don't know the answer offhand. In the back, what's your name? Joseph.
Does this trend like defer between
Joseph, Christina, Nikki, Sophia, Liz, Lucy. Yes.
Does this trend defer between like rural and urban areas? And so does like
It could within a country, absolutely.
Okay. So like if I would assume in urban areas the birth rate is probably lower per person.
Still today, yes.
So do you still see like the same lag, or is it just like not as noticeable in urban areas? So places that have like larger cities, more problems, less.
It's harder to make those comparisons in any country today, certainly anything but the poorest countries, because the healthcare infrastructure, there absolutely is a difference in birth rates between rural and urban areas around the world, but it's not like the rural people lack for access to clean water, electricity, cheap food supplies. a lot of the things that are health improving are broadly available within a society. So this is a high level society, level view. There are going to be a lot of subtleties. Some countries won't be exactly the same. Things are going to vary from place to place. What's your name?
Sarah.
Sarah.
You had mentioned on the graph, if the first stage, people died of acute and infectious. Do you know what people died of in the second, or is that where it wasn't specific?
I don't know what the specific, So here the main killers early on are acute infectious disease. By the way, we still die of all of these things, and there was mental illness. This is just a little cartoon summary, we're living long enough now to get these chronic diseases. And in fact, remember when I showed you in the last lecture, the top 10 killers 100 years ago and the top 10 now, and most of the killers were infections, all the top ones were then. We still have some infections now, but they've been replaced by cancer and heart disease and other chronic illnesses. Let me go on. I'm sorry, one more question.
Thank you. I was wondering why these transition periods have become more condensed over time. Is it because of global health efforts?
I think that is a very good question. It's discussed exactly in this paper. It has part to do with the fact that the world in the 21st century is different than the world in the 18th century. We're an interconnected world. People know about this. Information is flowing. Technology is flowing. Wealth is flowing, right? Everyone in the whole world is richer now than they were even 40 years ago. So the world is changing, and all of those things are contributing to this different pattern. But they still go through these phases, which is interesting, as shown here. In fact, again, if you go to this paper, they'll have 40 little cartoons of countries around the world, and you can see, the pattern in different countries. And the increasing life expectancy in the United States is mirrored by a changing composition of causes of death, which I've already alluded to. For example, cancer has been increasing in dark blue, and influenza and pneumonia in light blue have been declining at least again until COVID, which has scrambled everything that I've been teaching in this class for a very long time. So for example, if you look at, now they're normalized to 100%, that's why it's flat. You're just looking at the fraction of death caused by different sorts of things. And, you can see that, where is it? Where's cancer? Cancer is this dark blue. It's been sort of going up with time from when in 1935, it's this little percentage, 20 to 40, so it's about 20%, where it's 30% or whatever it is. And you can look at the different composition of death across time. So, people are living longer. They are dying of different things. Those are facts. But are they the better for it? And this is another important question we haven't considered yet. If I told you you could live to be 70 and then die, or you could live to be 70, then spend 5 years in a coma or in agony, and then die at 75, which would you prefer? Okay, who would like to live to be 70 and then die? You have two choices. Everyone has to raise their hand. You live to 70 and then drop dead, or you live to 70 and then spend another 5 years in a coma or agony and then die at 75. Who wants option A? Who wants option B? Right, so, okay, one person. All right, I love it. What's your name?
Cheyenne.
Cheyenne, great. Okay, so I would interview you about why you prefer it, but I'll have a better opportunity to interview you later. I won't forget when we talk about some of these things later on in the course. So you see, we're adding another subtlety now. We're saying, okay, people are living longer, that's good. They're dying of different things, that's good. But maybe we're not better off as a result of that, right? You've just proven that by your own expressed desires. A lot depends on the subtlety of what's happening to your quality of life during this whole period. So the question is, are we living better when we live longer? And Fries, in a classic paper from 1980, in your readings, by the way, it's always best to do the readings before you come to lecture because it really prepares you and you'll learn more. Of course, you need to do the readings before the exams, trust me. So one way or the other, you've got to do the readings, and it's efficient to do them before the lecture. Anyway, Fries in your readings has this figure. And he talks about something called the compression of morbidity and the relationship of morbidity and mortality changes. So one possibility is that you're born at some point in time, you get to be 55 years old, and then you're stricken with some illness. This is called morbidity, to have an illness. And then you live another, 21 years, and then you die at 76. One thing that might happen is that we might simply extend your life. You still fall ill at 55, but then you just live longer, 4 years longer, with this illness that you have. Okay? That's life extension. Another possibility is just a shift to the right, we delay the onset of morbidity by 5 years and the delay of death by 1 year. So both are shifting. You're getting sick late. Modern medicine or health improvements are keeping you from getting sick at a younger age. You do eventually get sick at a later age, and you also live a little bit longer. That's a shift to the right. And the last possibility that Fries outlines is the so-called, the most desirable thing, the compression of morbidity, which is you live a little longer, 78 instead of 76, but you also get the onset of illnesses later. Now you should see that this is preferable to this, right? If you get sick at a later age. You live longer, which is good, but the total years that you're living in a worse state is less than it was over here, where you had 21 years of illness and then died at 76. Here you have 13 years of illness and die at 78. So Fries says, is this what's happening? He asks the question. I told you a moment ago, we're living longer. That's great. We're dying of different things. That's good. But are we the better for it, right? Are we spending less lifespan in a bad state, like the coma and agony example, which was the extreme example I gave a moment ago? That's the question that Fries is asking. And the compression of morbidity is a good thing in and of itself. Moreover, it has policy benefits in that it offsets the effects of population aging and offsets the consequences of having an increasing number of elderly people who need medical care. In other words, if we prolong life and everyone is living longer, well, that's going to create certain other problems. You're going to have all these elderly people that need money to take care of them, right? Or maybe they're going to live longer and just be ill the whole time, and that's going to consume a lot of resources. So if at the same time we're lengthening life, we're getting the illness duration to be shorter by whatever else we're doing, including medical care perhaps, that's going to be a good thing from a social policy point of view, not just from the individual perspective. Now, one clue that this has actually happened, that Fries theorizes in this paper from 40 some odd years ago, not 40, 20 years ago, using data from even before then, is that over the last few decades, life expectancy and the number of elderly in our society have greatly increased, but the number of people in nursing homes has remained roughly constant or declined. Right? Life expectancy is going up, number of elderly are going up, number of people in the nursing home, which you can use as a proxy for how many people need care because they're sick or disabled or have problems, is roughly the same. And this is indirect evidence for the compression of morbidity hypothesis. Now, when Fries first suggested, actually in 1980, what is the, I don't know, I may have the, does anyone have the syllabus handy? I don't know if I have the wrong date. I have a vague memory that this paper was from 1980, so I don't know why it says 2003 there. I'll have to check. When Fries first suggested in 1980 that there would be a compression of morbidity, it was far from clear that there would be, and data to test this idea at the population level were very limited. But since then, however, we do have data, such as the data in this graph, showing estimates based on a national survey, again taken from your reading. And there was a dramatic drop in disability over 20 years at roughly the rate of 2% per year, which was greater than the decline in mortality, which was roughly 1% per year. So this shows the percent of people that are disabled gradually declining. Actually, I think I'm remembering Fries, this paper was published in 2003, but he cites a paper from 20 years before that he had published that was where he proposed this hypothesis, and this is the follow-up paper that was assigned to you in your readings. So, we are living longer, we are dying of different things, and we are healthier while we live. All three of these things are happening at the same time. Now, when we speak of disability, morbidity, or health, we assume that we all mean the same thing and that we know what we mean. But even this very simple thing of defining health is not so simple. And there are a number of ways, in fact, to define health. And one way is just to define health as the absence of disease. But as you all learned, when you give definitions, you're supposed to define the thing using different terms than the term itself. So the problem with this standard of health is the absence of disease is that it relies on that it may in part rely on the failure to detect a disease. It's a negative definition that relies on instruments to detect pathology, and it also simply shifts the problem to defining disease. So now we say, okay, health is the absence of disease. So now we're like, okay, well, how do you define disease? Well, disease is the absence of health. It's kind of a circular definition. So how can we define disease? Well, another way is the statistical standard, which compares people to the population in which they are. So this is a formal definition. Diseases of living organisms are internal states which interfere with the normal functioning of these organisms. What is to be considered normal functioning is calculated statistically with respect to an age group of a sex of a species. So we say, okay, here's some kind of density function, some kind of distribution of ability or health in the population, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to draw a line right here, and if you're above this line, we're going to say you're healthy, you're well, and if you're below the line, we're going to say you're diseased or sick. Okay? So it's a distribution of states. We draw an arbitrary line. It's a statistical definition. We say these people are healthy above the cutoff, and those people are not. So for example, we could have a test for running. I could take you guys out, and I could have you run, and I can say anyone that can run a mile in less than 6 minutes is healthy, and those of you that cannot, which would include me, are sick. Okay? That would be a statistical definition of health based on this kind of a situation. Now, by this definition, if you're born without a kidney at birth, this room is not quite big enough that one of you has been born, but one of you may have been born without a kidney at birth. So you just have one kidney. That happens to some people. But it's relatively harmless. Or if you're colorblind, probably one of you at least is colorblind, one of the men in the room, are disease states, right? Because being colorblind, you're like, okay, so we say, well, this is the distribution of people being able to see color. People who can see color, they're well. If you can't see color, you're sick. We're going to define you as sick. You're colorblind. Or people with two kidneys is the normal state. If you have two kidneys, we say you're well. If you have one kidney, we say you're sick. Okay? Now, some of you, if one of you had, usually when the class is bigger, someone says, I have one kidney and I'm fine. I'm like, exactly. That's my point. Or some of you will say, I'm colorblind and I'm just fine. I'll say, yes, exactly. That's my point. It seems arbitrary, right? But that's what the statistical definition would result in. Or the one of you were wincing when I said running less than 6 minute mile. You're like, wait a minute, I can't run a 6 minute mile, but there's nothing wrong with me. I agree with you. There's nothing wrong with you, but you can't run a 6 minute mile. So, I'm going to put you in this category over there. All right? So that's the statistical standard for defining health. Here's another definition, the adaptation standard. The states of health or disease are the expressions of the success or failure experienced by an organism in its efforts to respond adaptively to environmental challenges. The adaptation standard compares people to their surroundings. It stresses the performance of the organism in its physical, biological, and social environment. It focuses on the ability of an organism to perform given its situational background and its standard circumstances. So this sunburned man, who appears also to be deprived of IQ points and to have deliberately done this, is a poor fit with his high sun environment. Maybe he should kill one of his older siblings. That might have helped him with this problem. But more to the point, missing a kidney would not be maladaptive or reflective of ill health in this definition, because you can do just fine with one kidney, right? So this is your definition, and you look at a person with one kidney, you say, no, they're not. There's nothing wrong with them. They do not have ill health. By the statistical standard, they would. By the adaptation standard, they would not be diseased. In other words, the standard circumstances can vary across time and place, and society and from society to society. And as a result, a person with a particular physical or mental constitution may be able to fit in one environment and not another, and so may be judged unhealthy in one place, but not in another. And in fact, disability can be seen as a failure of adaptation. If your hip is decrepit and I replace it, you are no longer disabled. But what if I give you a motorized wheelchair? Right? So, like, you have a bad hip, like some of your grandparents have had a bad hip, they've had their hip replaced, and now we say they're cured. They're not disabled anymore. But what if instead of replacing their hip inside their body, I gave them a motorized wheelchair? Would we say they're disabled or not? Would we say they're unhealthy or not? If they can navigate their environment and cope, we might not and it wouldn't depend on the precise nature of the intervention that we gave them. Or if you're deaf or you're unhealthy in some way, are you unhealthy? And with a hearing aid, are you healthy? So if you have a cochlear implant, do we say now you're healthy or not? Do we say no, you're still unhealthy despite the fact that you have, by this technology, have been able to cope with your environment? Actually, one can get quite serious about the sunburn example. Here's what happens when you take a fair-skinned set of people and move them to an environment on the equator. This shows the incidence of melanoma, which is a deadly skin cancer, in countries around the world. And Australia and New Zealand have the highest rates in the world by far of this deadly disease. But the Aboriginal people of Australia do not suffer from melanoma. So it's not just the physical aspects of the environment, just to be clear, it's not just the physical aspects of the environment, like sunlight, that matter. Biological aspects can also be relevant to this fit. Historically, for example, Native Americans were just fine in terms of some aspects of their environment, or some aspects of their health with respect to their environment, until their environment changed by the introductions of Europeans and their old world infections. Epidemics of pathogens such as smallpox and measles raged through the population and decimated it. Here is one estimate on the left of the population decline in a population of Native Americans in Mexico from 1518 to 1593. There is over a 90% decline in less than 100 years. So the indigenous populations in Mexico just died in great numbers in just a 60-year period, from 25 million in 1518 to 2 million in 1593, and much of it was attributed to infection. Are we going to say that they were unhealthy because they got this disease? Or are we going to say they were doing just fine until their environment changed? And so we judge them to be unhealthy, dying from infection, because of the poor fit with their environment, which environment now has exogenously changed around them because of the introduction of old world diseases. And here's another example on the right. This graph estimates the population decline in the Illinois Indians from 1677 to 1765, and there's over a 70% decline in less than 100 years, again, largely due to infection. And the evolutionary biology selection effects, the genetic selection effects of these epidemics were so large that genetic analyses today of survivor populations can actually reveal what's called as population bottlenecks. A 2016 study of the Tsimshian people of Canada revealed a population crash in the 19th century that left clear shifts in immune-related genes. In other words, so many people were wiped out in the northern Canada from the introduction of old world diseases that only the uncommon individuals who had certain genetic immune variants that allow them to survive are still around, and we can go and test those human beings today and deduce when they must have died off. When did this population bottleneck occur? And in fact, based on this genetic data alone, at least 57% of the population was wiped out about 175 years ago. And it turns out that this number triangulates with historical accounts that suggest that 70% of the population perished due to smallpox. Smallpox whips through the population, kills almost everyone except a few people who had some natural immunity, and we see the signature of this today. And this is a 500-year-old drawing that depicts Nahua Native Americans suffering from smallpox. They didn't know what to make of this disease. They'd never seen it before. And here they are. Their environment has shifted. Are we to say they are unhealthy? Or are we to say because there's a poor fit between them and this biological feature of their environment, this smallpox? Now, a third way of defining health is as follows. In some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed. This is the social standard. In some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does by perceiving, naming, and responding to it. This is the social value standard, which compares people to ideals and ideas. How can a disease exist until we detect it, define it, and name it? For example, prior to the antibiotic era, having the sequelae of infections, such as a pockmarked skin, was normal and was not deemed to reflect a disease process at all. Everyone had it. There's nothing wrong with this. Or hypertension is another example. Prior to the invention of the sphygmomanometer, when we could measure people's blood pressure, we didn't even know about hypertension. How could we? So only when we invent a technology that allows us to say, aha, you have something that I am now calling hypertension, can we judge that you are ill from this condition versus not. And so by this standard, missing a kidney or color blindness are only diseases if we say so. If we suddenly declare that actually is a disease. And there are also many so-called culture-bound syndromes. Culture-bound syndromes comprise several kinds of illness or affliction, all of which are defined as culture-bound in that they do not have a one-to-one correspondence with the disorder recognized by Western allopathic nosologies, our categorization of disease, and often have obscure biological origins, and in that they are initially reported as confined to a particular culture or a set of related or geographically proximal cultures. And these pose somewhat greater conceptual problems, these so-called culture-bound syndromes. For example, in many parts of Latin America, there's a disease called susto. Has anyone heard of susto? Which is an illness attributed to a frightening event that causes the soul to leave the body, leading to symptoms of unhappiness and sickness. So in these parts of Latin America, they say, we have a disease we call susto. And if you get susto, you are unhealthy. But I, Western doctor, go there and look and say, there's nothing wrong with this patient. So which is true? Does the patient have a disease or not? That's the social standard, right? Where we define this condition. It's a culture-bound syndrome. Another famous example of this, seen typically in Malaysia, is Koro. Has anyone ever heard of Koro? Which is an episode of sudden and intense anxiety that the penis, or in rare female cases, the vulva or nipples, are receding into the body and could cause death, right? So they say, oh my God, I have Koro and my penis is being pulled up into my body, and when it comes all the way into my body, I will die. And the syndrome can even occur in epidemics. There can be epidemics of Koro. And the treatment is to have a trusted family member hold the penis 24 hours a day to prevent it from being pulled up into the body. Okay? So is that a disease? Is Koro a disease? Or would you say that's ridiculous? You know, there's no such thing as Koro. Well, not if you go there and you talk to these people. This is the social standard of this disease. And a very telling historical example in our country is Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a Louisiana physician and a member of the Louisiana Medical Association in the mid-19th century, named a disease he called drapetomania. Has anyone heard of drapetomania? Which is the insatiable desire of slaves to escape. That's a disease, damn it. They want to escape. We're going to call that a disease, okay? But, these sort of examples strike us as, weird previous historical times, other countries. Well, lest you think we are immune from this, back pain in the West is an example, perhaps, of a culture-bound syndrome. The rates of back pain vary widely, and the biological origins of back pain are very unclear. But a lot of middle-aged white men complain of back pain in our society, and what happens when they complain of back pain? They're excused from their obligations. They don't have to go to work. They have to go to bed. Doctors do all these tests. They x-ray them. We can't find anything wrong with you. Oh, but doctor, my back pain is terrible. It's awful. I can't walk. Oh my goodness. Yes, I understand. We define back pain, and that is what happens. Others have suggested that anorexia, which typically afflicts young women in our society, they develop this disordered perspective on their body. They think, I'm fat. And you look at them and say, you're not fat. But they think they're fat, and we call that anorexia. Anorexia is not seen in the Amazonia, in Japan, in other parts of the world, but it's seen widely in our society. Maybe that's a culture-bound syndrome. And this is one of the things we mean when we say that a disease is socially constructed, an idea that I'll return to later in the course, and we'll read Emily Martin's magnificent book, The Woman in the Body. So to recap, we've considered four possible definitions, types of definitions. The first, the absence of disease, just defines health by reference to its opposite. The statistical standard compares people to populations of their peers. The adaptation standard compares people to their environment, and the social standard compares people to ideals and ideas. And here is one more official definition, the WHO definition, which is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And there's still other definitions, health as happiness, or the so-called welfare theory of health, and so on. And the definition we choose is important because it implies obligations on patients, doctors, and society. Is health a personal or a communal good? And how can it be measured? And this connection of health to happiness and overall well-being is important for both conceptual and methodological reasons, in part because it relates to another concept I'd like to introduce, known as utility. Now, utility refers to now part of the reason I'm moving so fast, and I hate myself for it, is because I just so liberally allowed time for questions earlier. So I'm going to shorten these lectures so I can allow more time for questions given the class size. And if you guys are modeling good behavior by asking lots of questions, which I love, then I'll trim the lectures to allow more time. But anyway, I'm going to clip through this stuff because I do want to cover it, and there's some interesting ideas here. Anyway, utility refers to the happiness or satisfaction gained consuming goods and services or from being in a certain state. People are construed as rationally trying to maximize their utility and rationally trying to be as well off as possible. Utility is supposed to be a summary measure of everything we care about, and it's thus an expression of our values. But measuring utility and happiness is complicated and tricky. Many social scientists take a behaviorist view of utility. They say it is a hypothetical construct that accounts for observed choices. And in a bit of reasoning, principally in economics, that borders on a tautology in my view, they sometimes argue that people are rational maximizers of their own utility, and so by definition, whatever people do necessarily maximizes their utility. And I do not hold that view, because I leave open the possibility that you can make choices that do not maximize your utility very well at all. I think that judgments are at least as relevant as decisions and actions. I think that if I just look at you and no matter what you do, I say you're maximizing your utility, I don't think that can be quite right. I think you could make a stupid choice. And you even might recognize it as a stupid choice at some other moment in time. And that is not maximizing your utility. Well, how do we measure utility or health more generally? And proper research and understanding trends in disability, health, and quality of life requires a specification of what we mean and also how to measure it. So, for example, there are many ways of measuring health, and we'll use a bunch of these in the class. Death, first of all, that's clearly bad. So we can look at infant mortality rate or life expectancy. Physical measures like tests and exams. Disability measures, how quickly can you walk, your activities of daily living. Your grip strength is a very good measure of your fitness. Self-reports, like how would you rate your health. Symptoms, do you have any symptoms? Lifetime earnings is probably a reflection of your health. You can give you vignettes and say, do you think this is a healthy state or not? Or we could use three other methods, which I'd like to introduce, and I probably won't get to them all today. The standard gamble, the time trade-off, and visual analog scales. And the question is, what matters? Objective or subjective measures? And what if there's an inconsistency between the two? Should we privilege people's own perspectives or some more biological measures? Social or statistical standards? And why should we care? And also there's the question of whose values matter. Do we derive assessments of health states from people who have them or from people who do not? Do we ask the young or the old, the rich or the poor, about whether a particular state is a problematic state or not? And it can matter quite a bit. Consider whether we want to know how bad it is to have to walk with a cane. Assessing how bad it is depends on whether we ask young people or old people. If I ask you guys how bad it would be to have to walk with a cane, you'd say that sucks. But if you ask your grandfather, they'd be like, no, that's normal, it's great, I don't have a problem walking with a cane. So walking with a cane depends on who you ask, what age they are, and so on. So let's look at some of these measures in a bit more detail in the time I have left. And it turns out that one way that scientists do this is by doing a sophisticated version of the would you rather parlor game that probably many of you have played. Have you ever played this game? Like, would you rather have sex with Bert or Ernie? Would you rather be eaten by lions or by ants? Would you rather be able to fly or read others' thoughts? Be 3 feet tall or 9 feet tall? Drool frequently and uncontrollably or be a bedwetter? Which would you prefer? Who would rather drool frequently and uncontrollably? Who would rather be a bedwetter? Bedwetting is really popular in this class. Have to always eat standing up or always enter your car from the passenger door or hate your life but be popular, or love your life but be despised. Okay? So there are all these games. I'm sure you guys played them when you were in high school or middle school. But turns out scientists use a variant of this game to measure utility using what's known as a standard gamble. So let's say you wanted to measure the intrinsic healthiness of state A, or its utility. So you want to know, well, how bad is it to be in this health state A? So you give people a choice. You can say, with some probability, they can either choose A, and they will be immediately transported to this health state, like, for example, walking with a cane, or being on renal dialysis, or they can make choice B, and if they choose B, with probability P, they don't have the problem, they're in perfect health, or probability 1 minus P, they're immediately put to death. Okay? So for example, I can say, right now, I'm going to either, you can choose, from now on, be on chronic dialysis, right? You have to go to a dialysis. Some of you have relatives who are on chronic dialysis 3 times a week. You have to go and be dialyzed. If you don't get dialysis, you die. Your kidneys don't work. Toxins build up in your body, right? That's what it means to have kidney failure and be on chronic dialysis. So either right now I'm going to give you chronic renal failure, or I'm going to give you a choice, which is you have a 90% chance of being in perfect health, or a 1 minus P, 1 minus 0.9, a 10% chance of immediate death. What would you pick? Okay, let's give you that example. For the rest of your life, you have to go to dialysis 3 times a week, and your kidneys don't work, and you have all kinds of other problems for having renal failure. Or you can have a 10% chance of death immediately. Who would pick renal dialysis for the rest of their lives? Who would pick perfect health 90%, chance of death 10%? Okay, good. So you give people choices like that, and then you do a little, that allows you with a little bit of arithmetic to compute the utility, because when people are neutral to the choice, what you do then is you vary the probability until people don't care. Well, I don't care which of those two. And when they're indifferent to that choice, you know that the total value of this choice is the same as the total value of this choice. And you can say this probability P times the utility of perfect health is defined as 1. Immediate death is given a utility of 0. So P times 1 plus 1 minus P times 0 must be equal to the utility of this state. So the utility of this state is equal to P, the probability, times 1, plus 1 minus P times 0. That drops away, which means that the utility of this health state is simply the probability when people are indifferent. When you don't care whether you have sex with Bert or Ernie, with whatever probability, then we say, okay, that is the utility. Do you understand that example? I'm actually going to pause for 3 minutes. I'm not going to try to finish. I'm going to pick up this lecture at the beginning of the next time. And so I don't have to move as fast. So this is called the standard gamble, and it's one way. And there are other ways that you can elicit from people more formal assessments of different health states. Any questions? I'll get more disciplined with I'll cut my lectures to allow more time for questions if you guys seem to be a questioning class, and I'll get more disciplined at not spending more time so I don't have to race at the end. Any other questions about this? People understand this state? Okay, great. I'll see you next Wednesday. So no sections. You'll get more emails about this rigmarole and how we're going to cope with it from me. Yeah. Not more in healthcare, but less on the total of social studies.
I'll tell you about it.
You have to adjust for, we articulate expenses in our lives, and that was we do the same number of MRIs per capita in England, but they simply cost more here, and we have to adjust for that. I don't know if it was, but when people have done it, that's not the source of this. What's your name? Trust me. You're Sophia? Rita.
So retirement intentions that you like what's the sauce guy?
Remind me where that was in the lecture?
Yeah, you were talking about how retirement has not shifted.
Oh yeah.
I tested Isabel.
Oh no, I'm not anti-that, but the anti-that one is the following. If you ask working class people in our society why they don't move to where there's economic opportunity, you know what they say?
It's not good. Sorry. No.
What did they say?
Because all my friends and family. But you expect to live a life, if you're Yale educated and you're going to become a professional, where you will follow economic opportunity wherever it goes. Many of your friends who graduate from Yale take jobs wherever they are in the country. Very far, they're hanging around. Why is that?